I guess some of the main points to make around this are around where organizations go wrong in terms of innovation thinking and then like innovation approach. And like the big no-no or the big mistake that organizations make is to sort of like siphon innovation off as a stream or as a skunk works type thing of this is where innovation happens in the organization. And the better way of thinking about it is how do you embed innovative behaviors, processes, mindset into an organization at a larger level.
Hi, and welcome back to Adventures in Learning Design, a series of conversations about ideas, principles, research and practice, exploring how we can make learning more effective and more enjoyable, whether that's in the workplace, at school, at university or at home. My name's Laurie Harrison.
And my name is Tim Gifford.
And we're both co-founders of LearnJam, a digital learning agency and consultancy. Episode 8. Innovation. At the end of October, Tim and I spoke to Nick Robinson, one of the founders of LearnJam. As well as his LearnJam work, Nick also now does a lot of executive coaching and training with a focus on innovation and creativity. So Tim and I thought it would be interesting to have a chat with Nick, find out more about his thoughts on innovation, and the question of whether people can be trained to be innovative and what an innovative organization looks like. Hey Tim.
Hey Laurie, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
The clocks have just gone back and we are plunged into eternal darkness.
That's it. The wheel spins.
It's my least favourite week of the year, I have to say, this one. But, I'll look forward to March. It'll come soon enough.
Just fast forward through the next few months, mate. There's nothing really happening anyway. Just skip to the end and skip to March.
All right, I'm going to hibernate. I'll hibernate. I'll just hand this over to you, shall I, Tim? Yeah, does that work?
Don't worry about it. I'll give you a prod.
Yeah, I'm not going to hibernate because this is an extremely exciting episode of Adventures in Learning Design because we have a very special guest today, Mr. Nick Robinson, one of the founders of LearnJam. Hello, Nick.
Hello, Laurie. Hello, Tim. What an absolute pleasure to be here. I've been listening to the podcast avidly up until this point. I'm waiting for my invite. So it was lovely to see. Only took us to week 6 now?
This is episode 8, Nick. So, we had to make you sweat for a bit,
Wow.
Yeah, we had other more important guests to get first. So
I can imagine. Okay, well,
it is good to have you here. And we are going to be talking about innovation in this episode. And I know, Nick, this is one of your specialist subjects. You do a lot of work as an executive coach. You do lots of training sessions and training programs. And something that we've noticed, I guess, recently is that we've been approached by quite a few organizations wanting us to help them with innovation within their teams. So innovation training, developing innovation programs, helping L&D teams innovate in terms of how they work and how they provide learning. So we thought it'd be interesting and cool to have a chat with you, get your take on that and share our thoughts on that topic.
Definitely.
So I've already completely forgotten how we were going to go into
this. That's fine. Well, actually, just as you were talking about that, it made me think that I had a stat I read today, actually. I was actually delivering a training session today about creativity, which is very closely linked to innovation, but different in a way. And I read a stat, and this was from about 6 years ago, that says something like 90% of organizations have innovation as part of their kind of like company-wide goals or their like value set or something like that. The word comes up in like 90% of organizations' high-level plans or high-level values, whatever it is.
Right.
So it's not a surprise really that we get so many requests coming through for people in like, how do we train our people to be more innovative? How do we build this into what we're doing? And I suppose it kind of unearthed an interesting question, which is, can you train innovation either into people or into organizations as a thing? And the LearnJam, originally formerly ELTJam kind of backstory, we, the three of us as co-founders of the organization, came out from kind of more traditional publishing and kind of different areas. And I wonder, if we look back on that time, like how we saw innovation playing out in the organizations we were working in, and why do so many organizations want to train this into people? What's not working? Why is innovation not just flourishing in organizations like kind of mushrooms growing or whatever? What's going wrong that so many people feel the need to kind of train this in? And then the other question is, can you train this into people, into organizations? Those to me seem like quite interesting questions to consider.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. I mean, obviously the trite answer is that most organizations clearly believe that you can train this in because they spend a lot of money doing it.
Really? Yeah.
But I think the more interesting question is, but can you really?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The belief is there. The belief is built, right? But can you turn it so that?
Yeah, where's the evidence for that? And if so, how? What are some good ways to do that? Some ways that work. I guess why we thought it'd be really interesting to get your take, because you work in with a very wide range of organizations, training, like you said, creativity you've been doing recently, but all sorts of stuff. With senior teams in a whole load of different types of organizations.
Absolutely. And not just leaders either. And I think this is something that filters down through organizations and is expected to be part of people's roles, that you're expected to think innovatively and try and solve problems in new ways. And I suppose what I think organizations are going for there is this idea that if everyone in the organization is thinking innovatively, then things will sprout up and things will start developing that are going to solve problems in interesting ways and make life better for everybody. And I think it's worth maybe just unpicking these two terms of creativity and innovation initially, because I think they get put together and a little bit kind of misunderstood maybe. And the way I look at this, and there's been people that have written quotes about this much more elegantly than I could possibly do, but the idea of innovation being kind of creativity manifested as something, I think is quite an interesting way of looking at it. So what I think organizations are not looking for is like blind creativity, of just people being creative in very unstructured, undirected ways. What I think they're looking for is manifestations of creativity that are valuable in some way. And that value can be measured in lots of different ways. So I think how it's traditionally been thought of in terms of like, I don't know, the cool side of innovation, for want of a better word, is like massive breakthroughs in terms of product type, in terms of like new ways of doing things. So you think about like innovation, you think about like Apple, and you think about Google, and you think about all these big companies that have done like amazing, massive leaps forward in terms of how human beings interact with each other, how we view the world, and all these different kind of things. If you look at how that's defined in kind of the literature around innovation, it's this thing that's like primary innovation, big leaps forward in terms of new product categories, new types. The iPhone, classic example, and it's very hackneyed to rely on Apple for examples here, but they're very easily understandable and very broadly understood. But the first iPhone is considered like a primary innovation to some extent. It does the smartphone in a very, very, very amazing way that kind of was a leap forward, I suppose, in terms of how that was.
Yeah, and obviously in learning, we've got Moodle, I guess.
Primary innovation, case in point. Yeah, it's an interesting thing to talk about innovation because, and it's interesting to hear you talk about that there, Nick, to see or to say that it's not just free form. Like I think free form creativity is of itself useful. Like it definitely has its place, and it certainly helps take conversations in new directions. But innovation being, how did you say, like creativity, kind of manifested. Like manifested, but sort of with a structure and a format and kind of approach inherent in it. And I think when we talk about like training people to be innovative or training innovation into an organization, it's got this looseness around the term. It could almost be seen as like, I'm going to come in and train you to be funny, for example, or I'm going to train you to be kind. It's like, to what extent is it like almost an inherent human characteristic that is actually quite hard? So, this room full of people, you're going to leave here this week being funnier than you are, for example. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's often for me, it's got that sense about it. It's like, it's hard to quantify, and it's hard to kind of, I guess the question is, how much of it is like innate? Is it something that people can change their mindset around?
I would argue that none of it's innate. I think what happens is you basically have two things going on at the same time. One is that I think that there needs to be some kind of structure within organizations that facilitates innovation. And what a lot of organizations do, and they do wrong at that point, is they think, well, that means like an innovation team, or that means like an innovation work stream, or some kind of like siphoned off path that innovation happens in. And this is like a really common way to do it. I mean, like I think the phrase that a lot of people, listeners, might have heard is this idea of like skunk works, which refers to this idea of basically like putting a bunch of people in a different building from everyone else and just saying like, come up with all the crazy innovative ideas and kind of do all that stuff. And this has been traditionally a very typical way of running innovation in organizations, this idea that you need to give people the room and the headspace to take them away from the day-to-day rigors of the business to allow them to think in new innovative ways. But that doesn't really help in a lot of ways, because what it ends up doing is it ends up creating this us and them feeling within the organization where there's like, oh, some people like to work on the cool, innovative stuff, and the rest of us have to do the grind. And then what it basically means is when the innovation team bring all the ideas back into the business, they're like rejected by the business because it's like, well, we don't like those guys because those guys get to work in the cool new office and they get to, Laurie, weren't you in like a skunk works team at some point in a previous life?
Yeah. It was called the New Media Team.
There you go.
Yeah. We didn't get to do particularly cool stuff, but I guess, no, but I think you're right. And I think the term I've heard used is organizational antibodies.
Interesting.
So
nice.
you have this fresh, sort of fairly delicate new idea that's quite cool and has potential, and then you sort of bring it back into the organization and business as usual kills it.
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't quite fit, or it's not ready for commercial exploitation yet.
Yeah.
And therefore it's competing for resources with other things that are already well established. There are processes and systems and ways of working that it doesn't fit with.
It's kind of seen as the other, isn't it? It's like this other thing that's coming. I think the antibody thing is like it's an invasive, it's an invasive parasite of some kind, almost like it needs to be rejected in some way. I think that's an interesting way of looking at it.
I think so. Yeah, it's interesting that you say that the way that you say that. That's actually not the thing to do, because I think we have to hold our hands up and say that 5-6 years ago we were going into major educational institutions and publishers and so on and saying, this is what you need to do, guys.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Well, this is part of innovation. You learn from mistakes. This is a fundamental, I remember, like a core tenet of innovation is you try things, and if they don't work, you figure out what you learned from that thing, and then you go on and try something new. But you take the learning from it. And I think it was a very fashionable way of thinking about innovation for a long time. And to come back to Tim's original question there around the innateness of it, I think it does need some kind of structure, but that structure in the organization doesn't need to be a separate stream. It can just be a culture, for example, or a climate where experimentation is encouraged. And what that often looks like actually is not so much we encourage experimentation, is that we don't punish or provide any kind of sort of like retaliation for mistakes. So you kind of encourage this environment. And I use the phrase climate and culture there, actually, just to disambiguate those terms. Culture we understand as this big picture thing. Organizations have a culture they're trying to get through. Climate is like what it feels like to work in my team or for my boss. So like, you can have this organization that says we value, learning from mistakes and innovating through all that kind of stuff. That can be the company culture. But if your boss jumps on your back and has a go at you every time you make a mistake, then the climate in your team isn't innovative. You may have an innovative culture in inverted commas at the organizational level. If your boss just like kills you every single time you make a mistake, then you haven't got an innovative climate. And it's the climate that makes a difference. So in my team, if I figure out a better way of doing this thing we're doing and I try it and it doesn't work and it causes a problem, what does my boss do? Does my boss say, listen, Nick, what you did was completely unsanctioned and unacceptable, and I'm going to report you to HR, dock your pay, whatever it might be? Or does my boss turn around and say, wow, okay, well, that was like a really massive mistake and problem you just caused, but I see why you were doing it. I see what you were trying to get to. What have you learned from that, and what should we do next? That starts to create an innovative climate, which is kind of the structural piece, I think, that we were talking to, thing about the innateness. So I think there does need to be some kind of sense in the organization of, we want people to try new things, be really curious, and we'll come back to curiosity, I imagine, in this session, in this conversation later. We want them to be curious and try new things, and we're going to create some kind of safety net for that, which allows the innovation to happen. But the other innate side of that, Tim, so if you think about it, the other side is like, are people as human beings naturally innovative? So if you look at the human aspect of innovation is creativity. That's the human bit of it. What turns that into something tangible and manifest is often the process bit. So there's this, is it now a committee I can take this idea to that can turn it into a product? Or like, is there an approval process, a budget I can secure? But the creativity bit is absolutely not an innate skill whatsoever. That is absolutely a learned mindset and approach to the world. And often what it comes from ultimately is kind of curiosity to some extent. I'm interested in new ways of doing things and challenging the status quo. But also I'm very open-minded about ideas and approaches that may not immediately seem sensible or seem good. The idea that I'm not closed off straight away to new ways of doing things, new ways of looking at things. And I might look at something and think, that doesn't work very well. I wonder if we tried this, and then think, that's a ridiculous idea. But should we just see where it goes? It's kind of that idea of not being like, it's a ridiculous idea, park it, get rid of it. And also when a colleague says, why don't we try this instead? Your first instinct isn't no. It's or yes, but. It might just be, yeah, and let's see what happens. It's that kind of idea. It's an openness, I suppose. So very long-winded way of answering your original question, Tim. I don't think it's innate at all, which is why I think it can be trained, which is why I think, again, to come back to the original question, can you train this into people in an effective way? I think you can, but you need to approach it from not just a set of tools that people need, although those are absolutely vital, and there are some interesting tools that we can approach, but also a tended way of thinking about innovation and within an organization, how leaders and managers think about it as well. So we don't stifle this kind of stuff.
It's interesting, So maybe the focus is, and going back to your point around that original model of like hiving off the innovation unit and putting them out in a shed in the middle of the field somewhere to do whatever they need to do, and then inviting them in periodically to update the team on what they're doing, but being met in the process by like the daily grind. So maybe rather than addressing innovation through the otherness, like address the daily grind. That's what's stopping it. That's the thing. Like if you work on that, then you get these sort of instances where people do feel encouraged and supported and safe to do these things.
Completely. And I think the idea let's tackle this for a second, because I think that idea of the daily grind is what contrasts with what we talked about earlier in terms of primary innovation. This idea we have that innovation is about massive leaps forward in terms of product category and product type and that kind of stuff. It's sometimes called like silver bullet innovation, but it's really rare and it's really hard. It does require some magic touch to some extent, or just some incredible matching of like people, luck, time, space coming together. What's much more common and actually much more valuable over time is what they call like secondary innovation, which is basically fixing all these tiny elements of the grind that are getting us down. So like, if you're looking at the way your business operates and thinking like no one's being creative, the way to fix that is not to hive off a bunch of people to be creative. It's to look at that system and be like, why is no one being creative in this system? Right? There's like something systemically wrong here. And actually what that's done, so like I said, that's done this like secondary innovation. And what that comes down to is looking at the way we work and the way we do things and thinking, can we just start to improve a bunch of stuff in really small ways? And it's known as the aggregation of marginal gains, this idea that it's really hard to improve one thing by like 1,000%, but you can improve 1,000 things by 1% and completely transform the way your business works. And this idea is not unknown or uncommon. I'm sure many people listening have heard of this before, but it's kind of not exciting in the same way that primary innovation is or silver bullet innovation is. It doesn't end up with an iPhone, ultimately. Maybe it does ultimately, but it doesn't immediately end up with an iPhone. It ends up with the expense submission process now takes 3 minutes less to do than it did a month ago. It was like, golf clap kind of cricket kind of thing.
Brilliant.
Exactly.
Cheers for that.
But if you save 3 minutes on every single process for every single employment in an organization, you do that 100 times, suddenly people have room to do other things. And it's about unlocking space and time for things like other kind of creative endeavors and that kind of stuff that we actually don't get the chance to do because of the daily grind. So I think fixing the daily grind is a really interesting innovation challenge and one that should be relished and not viewed as boring or whatever.
I might be wrong on this, but to me that seems like the silver bullet innovation. I mean, that's like Apple is the classic example of that, isn't it? And maybe someone like Amazon might be the example of the marginal gains thing, where it's like relentless pursuit of optimizing every little little pieces, and suddenly you've got this absolute juggernaut that's taking over the world.
And isn't Jeff Bezos the richest man in the world as the founder of that organization? And Amazon is not an exciting company by traditional metrics of excitement that you might view. You look at the Amazon website and it's like, it looks like Walmart designed a website, or as if Safeway designed it. It looks like that, but probably very deliberately, right? Because it's essentially operating in that same space, but it's doing things, like I said, by supply chain, logistics, delivery, all that kind of stuff, just like honed to the absolute nth degree of efficiency. And as a result, they're massively successful. There's nothing exciting about that, but I kind of always feel sad in a way when people come to innovation training. So rather than say, I can't help you create the new iPhone, that's like the chances of that happening are absolutely minimal. But don't think of innovation like that. Think of innovation just like making everything a little bit better. And actually, what helps with that actually is looking at some of the places in the world in which that's manifested in a more positive way. It's things like looking at the concept of Kaizen in Japan. This idea of incremental improvements or marginal gains in process efficiency. I think this was born, Laurie, correct me if I'm wrong, because we've taught this, haven't we? But like car plants, right? Like Toyota and Toyota, exactly. This idea that if you can increase the speed by which a wing mirror is attached to a car by 2 seconds for every single car, over 10 years, that translates into X amount of productivity gains and cost savings, that kind of stuff. But the idea that your goal as an employee, and this is what's important as well, as every employee of that organization, every single person's goal is to spot opportunities to micro improve how things work. And it's not just about leaders, and it's not just about innovation specialists. It's from the person putting the wing mirror on the car. That person's best placed to know how to improve that by 2 seconds. Clearly, right? So this idea of almost this democratization of innovation, that it's everyone's responsibility. But on top of that, everyone's idea is welcome. It's the responsibility democracy thing as well. Like, you can't say to everyone's responsible for this, but we don't want to hear everyone's ideas. You've got to say everyone's responsible, and we have a forum for everyone's ideas. Then it works.
So how does this? Let's kind of role play this a little bit. Like, I'm a business owner, 500 employees, been going for 15 years. Innovation is now a common conversation around senior management, for example. Like, we need to innovate. But what I understand from this is that I don't need to kind of go in and replace everybody's desks with stand-up desks and kind of put interesting decals on the walls and put ping pong tables in, and I'm not ripping out and starting again. But what I'm seeing is I need to address. We've talked about the daily grind, but I need to address like systemic changes, like incremental changes in my organization. How do I find those, and how do I get people on board in doing that with me?
Well, actually, so things like the ping pong tables and that kind of thing, they do have a place in this to some extent. Not because they're. I mean, I say the wall decals. No, essentially, what this comes down to is like, where is people's cognitive capacity going in the organization? Like, where are people spending their brain power? And the brain is not an unlimited resource, right? Like, within the typical workday, your brain has X number of kilowatts of power to place in terms of focus and attention, essentially. And managing that is quite important. And if it's being taken up by loads of stuff like processes that are kind of grinding and cognitively challenging, more challenging than they need to be, then people aren't thinking creatively. But things like the ping pong tables and stuff do give people moments of downtime where actually, and moments of like free association and conversation with people. Like, let's imagine Tim, you and I playing ping pong, we're batting the ball back and forth. How's your day been? Oh, I'm having a bit of a nightmare. Actually, this thing's happened, and for those of you who can't see the video while we're recording this, I'm doing ping pong actions while I'm talking through this.
Good technique, Nick, by the way. I was about to compliment you on that. Yeah.
So Tim and I have a discussion then about something that's not working. He's got a problem. I help him come up with an idea for it because we've managed to break away from the grind, and now we're talking about something over a ping pong table. So there is some value to that to some extent. To come back to what you were originally asking there, Tim, like, what should that business owner do? I suppose it would come down to thinking about, well, when people say, like, we need to innovate, like, what are they actually asking for there? Like, what's the problem you're trying to solve behind the innovation? And it's usually something, without wanting to categorize everyone, it's usually something like we're losing market share, or we're not retaining talent, or our product is not working as well as it used to. There's usually something going wrong, something dragging in the organization that's stopping. So innovation becomes the kind of plaster or the band-aid that they put over it. But, looking at things like, I would always just argue, like, you start, the way we do with design thinking in general at LearnJam, when we look at problems we're trying to solve for clients, that kind of stuff, like, it's like, what's the problem you're trying to solve that you think innovation is the solution for? And this is what, when it comes to when we train some of this stuff to people, we look at frameworks and stuff from design thinking and that kind of thing, because they actually help quite often get underneath the skin of the issue we're trying to solve here. And when people say innovation, what they're usually looking for is like some kind of silver bullet to a different problem. There's nothing to do with innovation. It's to do with market share, or it's to do with staff retention, or whatever it might be. And actually what can look like innovation to a lot of people is actually just understanding the problem you're trying to solve better. And coming up with ideas to solve it. Like, that in itself could feel like an amazing innovative breakthrough, because all you've done is pause for a second to understand what you're trying to do. So for me, like, we talk a lot about design thinking and that kind of stuff in the organization. And I know you guys have talked about it varying angles in this podcast. But for me, it's all connected. It's all about understanding the problem you're trying to solve and how to solve them. And when that becomes a new product or a new system or a new process, it's called innovation. But it's not necessarily labeled that as such automatically by people. So Tim, as that business owner, I want to get under the skin of what's going on and what problem you're trying to solve, essentially, with your innovation.
Let's just take that a little bit further then. So we've done that, and we've uncovered that within this organization, within this business that we're talking about, there's real resistance to change. There are very conservative attitudes. People are happy with the way they work. There are very well-established processes and systems in place that have been running for decades that everyone is quite happy with. Thank you very much. They don't see the need to change. The current product range is selling perfectly well. So thanks very much. Yeah, but we're fine as we are. So yeah, that's quite a challenge, isn't it?
It is.
And, as the company owner, you might see that. No, that's a major problem.
Yeah,
Nick, help. What shall I do?
So what's basically at play here actually is a cognitive bias known as the familiarity bias, where basically we are deeply comfortable with what we know, and we like to be comforted by the status quo. Essentially, that's essentially what familiarity bias means. And what it basically leads to in terms of downside is that if you have a business that's performing well or a process that's working fine, and that's very much like part of your day to day. So the example I always end up coming back to, I think, is like expenses with this, because I think it's the thing I've always hated most about any job I've ever had in my life is doing expenses. And the problem is with expenses is that whatever system you use, it always works. So the end result of it, you always end up submitting your expenses and they get processed and you end up getting your money. Mm-hmm. And so because it works, it's like often just let be. I mean, like, I'm thinking about other colleagues, we've spoken to, people that work with us over the past. We talked about, I won't mention any specific organizations, but like where sometimes people spend like 2 days of their month working on their expense reports for things. And you just sort of think, oh my goodness. But the reality is, because it works and because that's the way we do it, that in itself becomes the reason to keep doing it. So it's funny, like, you use that phrase, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I've actually heard that phrase said differently, which is that if it ain't broke, break it, which I think is actually really nice of looking at things. And it's almost tied into, I don't want to quote Zuckerberg too much, but that idea of like, move fast and break things. The idea of like looking at something that ostensibly works fine, our customer acquisition strategy is fine, or our publishing process is fine, or our proofreading strategy is fine, or whatever it might be, it all works fine. There is still value in looking at that and saying, but what if it worked like 50% better? What then? Like, what if we're missing something? Because it works fine. What if actually fine is 80% of what it could be if we just spent half an hour thinking about how to do it differently? Yeah. And I think, again, this is other examples of this secondary innovation where it's like, okay, well, let's actually go through and break all our existing processes and see if we can put them back together in a better way. That's actually quite an exciting job to give to people as well, right? It's given something that ostensibly works quite well and say, right, break it, put it back together, make it work better for them. And it's, the familiarity bias, though, is a really powerful bias because it's rooted in comfort. And that, I think, is the enemy of innovation, like the idea of comfort. And, Laurie, you tied it in really very cleverly there to the idea of fear of change. And that's exactly what it is. I think, we kind of feel like if things get too shaken up, if things change too much around here, if things look too different, is my job safe? Is my department safe? Am I going to get automated out of existence? All these are very, very, very rational. I was about to say that. They're not rational necessarily. They're understandable fears that people have about the advancement of technology. Not to say innovation is always about technology, but of things moving in a new and exciting direction. So how do you combat that? I think good innovation should always feel slightly seat of your pants. This is a bit we're in unknown territory here. This feels a bit dangerous, and if it like we could break everything and it could all fall apart. Like I think that kind of is what it should feel like. And embracing the uncertainty around it, embracing that natural discomfort that comes from looking at something and saying, we're going to break this and put it back together and see what it looks like. That's going to feel bad, right? You're going to feel like you're going to get into trouble. So we come back to this idea of climate and culture where like you have to feel like if I'm going to break this entire system and try and put it back together, if I break it, I'm not going to get fired. If I break it, you know what I mean? I'm going to get in some way rewarded for trying to make things better. Tim, as that business owner, are you feeling any more excited about innovation or any more sure what to do?
Yeah, well, I think so. And I think what's interesting there, this idea of what I like about that is this idea of the way you framed it there was kind of almost like tasking people with it as well.
Yeah,
like giving explicit permission, open permission, maybe even like specific like task. I want you guys to look at our expense procedure.
Exactly.
Like it's been absolutely fine. Like no one's had a problem with it. But that doesn't necessarily mean like,
there is
it can be done better. So like take that little chunk and like play with that. And I think there's this idea of like play, experimentation, break it.
Completely,
like, I won't mind if you completely mess it up, but like maybe we learn that actually that is the right way to do it, but like that's validated. But
just imagine a manager saying that. Like, let's imagine you work in a large organization. Let's imagine you're a director of finance for like a large university, for example, and you decide you want to totally innovate, like have supplier invoices are paid or whatever. It's very, very, very nerve-wracking because you're not like a C-suite executive at that university, right? You're not like the head honcho, whatever it might be. You are like reporting into probably the chief financial officer, wherever it might be. If you break the entire supplier, whatever that bit of the business is you're looking to innovate, if you break it, there might be repercussions. So I think there does need to be a sense of like, what does safe experimentation look like? And that's often about like micro improvements or micro changes. It's not about dismantling whole systems. It's about looking at like, what are the little changes we can make here? Can we shave 2 seconds off that? Can we shave a minute off that? And that way, like when things go wrong, it doesn't break everything completely. And I think, if you look at some of the kind of you're looking at our careers going back, now, I mean, how many years now since working in publishing, taking publishing as one field that the three of us have.
10 years, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking 2000, I think I'm 16 years now. Yeah, 16 years now.
Yeah.
And if I look at like breakthrough innovative attempts at innovation in publishing, they've often looked like massive new approaches to doing course design, or like using technology, like, like blended learning suddenly is like a massive leap forward. And we're investing in startups that promote that. We're kind of making up new product types. So it's like huge, big leaps forward, founded on nothing other than a hunch that this might work, or a sense of like, this is the cool new shiny thing we should be focusing on. So no safety net at all under any of that. And we've all seen, I think the three of us seen massive failures in our past, and obviously we had nothing to do with it in terms of like doing things.
Absolutely nothing to do with it.
Exactly, exactly. Of either companies or products or whatever that were deemed to be highly innovative and potentially could have been, but failed hugely because they took a moonshot with no real sense of, are we doing this in a structured way that allows us to experiment safely and fail and learn and move on? It was like, basically, will this 6-level 1 million hour blended learning course sell in the market? Let's say yes, and let's build it over the next 6 years and then launch it.
Yeah.
And then let's hope for the best. That to me is like the worst innovation thinking. I'll be really blunt about that.
Yeah. And we still see it all
we still
the
see
time.
It, of course we do.
In
exactly.
Learning. Yeah.
Because it's paradoxically making the people involved feel safe when they're not. Because it's basically putting in structure like planning and scheduling and specification. It's putting in very, very, very tangible structure that gives people a sense that what we're doing is controlled in some way. And it kind of is up until the point you release it to the market and no one wants it. Because what you can't control and plan for there is are we solving the right problems? Are people excited about what we're doing? Are we going to help people make their lives better? All these things. That to me is like innovation done worse than you can ever imagine.
We had a brilliant business plan. The spreadsheets were amazing. We
worked.
had a really great PowerPoint slide deck, and then 6 months after launch, we shut it down, and we wasted millions of pounds. I mean,
wasn't there a big story about this recently? And I mean, I'm not going to remember the product names. We might have to fix this in post. But like, there was a kind of micro video product launch that was it was launched by very, very experienced US TV executive Jeffrey Katzenberg or something like that.
Oh, Katzenberg. This is new this week, isn't it?
It's folded this week. Basically, they decided they were going to be like the anti-lean, anti-agile.
Yes.
We know what people want. We've been TV executives for years and years and years. We know exactly what people want. People want 8-minute episodes of series on your mobile phone, and they built the entire product out and launched. And it took 6 months to go bust.
Yep. Quibi. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it.
That's exactly it. Quibi.
Yep.
So Quibi is a great example of this, where you basically take people who've got quite a traditional sense that like their expertise in a field, in this case TV production, is a guarantee of them being able to come up with new innovative ideas. And they basically say, we know what people want because we have all this experience.
Yeah.
And then you use all that experience to build out this very, 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 very thorough, very well-planned product launch, whatever. We don't experiment, we don't release anything early, we don't do an MVP, we just get something out there. And then this is what people want. We're that confident. And Quibi, they raised, I mean, maybe you can see what you're looking at now. They raised like millions. Hundreds of millions.
Enormous sums,
And it took them 6 months to go out of business.
I mean, the mindset there is that if we launch something that isn't really rich and full-featured and top of the range in terms of production quality and scale, then it won't succeed in the market. And that's the argument. Again, I've heard that many times with learning projects as well. Unless we spend millions on this and we've got multi-level learning program with video and all sorts of stuff, then it won't work. It's like, well, So it's, like you said, it's the moonshot or the silver bullet approach.
Exactly.
But the rationale for that is that if you launch something too small or too half-baked, then you won't know if it's going to work.
I totally understand where that's coming from. The mistake people are making is they're associating product launch with what we've traditionally looked at a product launch, which is like you have to launch to the mass market. The mass market should be your ultimate goal of a product, right? That shouldn't be your starting point. There's very few products. I'm sure we could name a couple if we sat and braced on them for a second that go from like nothing I mean, again, I keep coming back to the iPhone as being the example of this, right? Like the products that go from nothing to mass market. That's kind of not how product works these days, right? You go from, and you can look at the adoption cycle stuff as well. I think of the idea of like early adopters and mass market laggards, all that kind of stuff. But this idea that like you have to go from a standing start to mass market is the enemy of innovation. It gets people thinking that you straight away have to appeal to everybody. But the reality is that how good products get to mass market is just through, and sometimes years of like small devoted group of fans who love what you're doing, even though you're messing it up, but really love what you're behind, love your vision, love your values, love what you're trying to do. Like you solve a real problem for them, so they really want you to succeed. So they're really supporting. They'll give you some money. They might invest, whatever might happen. And you just keep going, keep building on that thing, keep incrementing on it until eventually, more people start to see what you're doing, and it builds into this lovely kind of wave of support that turns into a mass market product. Yeah. This is where I think everything's got messed up in terms of startups and stuff, is that process can take so long that you just have to raise so much money to get through that bit that most founders spend all their time raising money and not focused on like trying to build that amazing product and satisfy all those users and those people and get to that point. You essentially have to do it against the clock. That's the problem.
Yeah. Like you said, you either keep raising money or you get lucky. Yeah. And I guess in learning and education, there are commercial products or companies that have succeeded in doing that. It looks like, for example, Duolingo, which we've talked about a lot over the last few years, they seem to have crossed that chasm. They've got revenue now, but it took hundreds of millions of dollars and years for them to do that with a very slick product.
Yeah.
So,
and is it good still? Are we convinced yet?
Wow. All I'm going to say is it's a very slick product. I'll leave it there.
There you go.
If you want to learn random phrases, then yes, it can be quite good, I guess. Yeah.
But maybe it's interesting to kind of, we do talk about Duolingo quite a lot, but my issue with that as a product has always been like, I think fundamentally, if the thing you build doesn't actually do the thing you say it does, you ultimately fail. Yeah. You can be propped up by great marketing, you can be propped up by a lot of investment, you can be propped up by all these things. But if your goal is to help, for example, in Duolingo's case, learn a language, if that is essentially kind of Emperor's New Clothes territory for that product, that it just ultimately doesn't work. How many businesses ever created like mass value by just not doing the thing the customers thought the thing did? It's got to kind of do it, hasn't it? Exactly. So that's the idea, tying back to this idea of value in innovation. Like the core of it all has got to be like, how do we create value for people in innovating? Why are we doing it? What are we trying to improve here? How are we trying to make people's lives easier?
So putting my business owner hat back on and putting my ping pong paddle down just for a second, step away from that conversation with you over a few rounds. Is it rounds of ping pong?
I think it's rounds of ping pong. Yeah.
We'll go with that.
Cool. So I see now that my team, like innovation for me and my team, isn't around huge silver bullets, huge sweeping changes or measures, but it's around looking at incremental changes to systems, like those 1-2% each time. But those innovations, those tweaks, those 1-2% still require a creative mindset to approach them, isn't it? So it's like, don't just think about what you're currently doing, think about something else, think about how you might approach those 1 and 2% slightly creatively. How do I get them? All my team are engineers, and I'm not saying engineers can't be or aren't creative, but like these in their role, they're not engaged with creative tasks in the same way. So how do I get that kind of coming through?
It's a really great question, actually, and it's one that I think gets to the bottom of some of the misconceptions around creativity as a thing, that creativity is innate in some way, or that it is the realm of people with creative jobs like designers or whatever it might be. But the reality is that a lot of creativity requires or is best delivered through quite formal processes and quite formal structures. And things like, let's take convergent and divergent thinking, for example. This is a technique we use quite a lot at LearnJam as part of our kind of, workshopping process with clients and come up with ideas. And this idea really that if you're just brainstorming something, a really simple but very logical process you can apply to that brainstorming is, let's start divergence. Let's start with the biggest, widest range of possible solutions that we can possibly come up with. And then let's try and go convergent and bring those things down into narrow categories and to something much more specific. So that idea of going from the broad to the specific is a really simple creativity tool that's built around logic, right? That's a really obvious way to logically go from a bunch of ideas to a bunch of ideas, many of which won't be good, to a small number of ideas that will be good. There's nothing in that requires you to be innately creative or be like Picasso or something like that, or Shakespeare in terms of creativity. It's about being like, right, here's a really some process. Step one of this creativity process is, it sounds really boring, right? We need that structure, right? And even looking at things like, let's take art. Picasso is an example. I'm based in Barcelona. Picasso is very much like a feature of this city. There's a very big Picasso museum here. You look at like the volume of work Picasso produced to get to the number of masterpieces that he produced. There's sketches, there's tiny things, there's versions of things. There's like a huge amount of legwork that goes into ultimately what hangs in the Picasso Museum here in Barcelona or in the Louvre or whatever it might be. But the idea that there's just a process that goes into that, and that would very much have been his personal process, how he gets to that point. But the idea of you can apply rigor and logic to creativity, that is completely the case. So a group of engineers together to solve a problem, they come up with some amazing ideas. They're amazing problem solvers. They're not going to draw anything particularly pretty necessarily, but they're going to come up with some amazing ideas.
Structure, frameworks, and sometimes and artificial limitations is another one as well.
The limitations are
Picasso's
great.
blue period, anyone?
There you go. Absolutely.
Personal favourite, sure.
Absolutely true. I mean, you need limits. I mean, if I turn around to both of you two right now, I mean, you're both kind of, I know you're both musicians, and this might be a relatively easier task. But if I turn around to you now and basically say, give you 5 minutes, can you both write me a poem? Immediately, if I was in that situation, the alarm bells go, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? This is going to be a nightmare. But if I turn around to you and say, can you write me a haiku? It's a very different task, right? Because I've given you straight away a structure and a formal way to work through that. And you're still going to have a creative output from that, but it's going to be within certain constraints. And that is hugely valuable in terms of creativity. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. So yeah, I think this idea that logic is at odds with creativity, I think is really wrong. I think it needs it. And I think this is part of how coming back to the original question that Laurie, you asked at the very start of this, is how do you train this into people well? I think you give them structured ways of thinking about being creative and therefore maybe innovative in terms of turning that into something tangible. But you give people tools, processes, systems, things that we know work from loads of different types of industries, loads of different types of, be that design thinking or be that whatever it may be. There are tools that have been proven to work and help people come up with great ideas. And sometimes it's just a question of just help people understand how those things work and give them some practice in how to do them. And then they take them off and try them themselves. And that to me is at the core of great innovation training.
That's it, man. It's like creativity isn't like a sheet of blank paper. It's 50 sheets of blank paper, draw on every single one of them until you've got, by the 49th, something that kind of feels and looks
comes up with
a bit more concrete and it's going to take you 48 to get there.
To get to that point, exactly.
There's no single blank sheet. I like the idea of, and this is kind of talking about incremental changes, but around daily behaviours, like doing one small thing differently every day, whether it's in the work environment where you're trying to sort of embed this sort of innovation culture, or just on the way to work, take a different route, change, take a different, just walk to work a different way, or listen to a different album on the way there, just mix up your daily routine a little bit, and just have those little moments of divergence just in your daily practice, and
this is also actually
builds up,
tied into this side of discomfort as well. Actually, so this idea that actually what holds you back sometimes with this is this attachment we have to feeling comfortable, and things like breaking up your route to work. Or the example I love to give, and I actually try this myself quite often because it does make me feel uncomfortable, is going shopping without a shopping list. Nice. It's knowing going to the weekly big shop, knowing you're going to forget a bunch of stuff, but challenging yourself to try and remember it, but knowing at some level that you're going to walk out and be like, oh, mold and sea salt. That's what we do. That's what we didn't get. And then you're going to have to deal with the consequences of that as a result. That is actually quite useful training to get yourself used to that feeling of I'm not quite sure what we're doing here. This doesn't feel like it's going to work. This doesn't feel like this is going to end well. That kind of feeling. You learn that discomfort. You learn to live with it.
During lockdown, we started getting vegetable boxes delivered, which just had random stuff that I would never normally like.
The celeriac week.
Yeah. Well, we had a squash and a pineapple, and I had to make dinner with that. So it forced me to be creative. And I made a Thai curry with it.
I was going to say curry.
Quite nice.
There you go.
Yeah.
I was going to say. Well, that's interesting because that's an interesting association, isn't it? You start thinking, okay, well, what foods have root vegetables in them, and what foods have a touch of sweetness in them, and you straight away go to curry at that point, and that takes you down that interesting road. So, I've never had a butternut squash and pineapple curry, but it sounds
it was actually all right.
I
told my mum about it. She said, "Oh my god, that sounds disgusting."
See, she doesn't have the innovative mindset.
Get with it, Mum. Come on. This is the innovator's curry.
We should train her the innovator's curry.
When life gives you a squash and a pineapple, make a Thai curry.
Exactly.
That's the message.
And on that note,
that might be a good
place to wrap.
Fade to music. Adventures in Learning Design was brought to you by LearnJam.
To learn more about what we do and who we do it for, and to download your own free copy of our learning design principles, head over to learnjam.com.
All right, our Chief Executive Coach and L&D Specialist, Mr. Nicholas Robinson, MD.
Yeah.